going to read the beginning and the end of the essay, but I think that it's going to make sense, hopefully. So it's called Fruits of the Desert. A decade ago, on my way to the food co-op in Ann Arbor, I played the game I have played my whole life, where a stranger asks me what I am, and I let them guess my ethnicity. Depending on the country I'm in and the way I'm dressed, people assume that I'm Colombian, Punjabi, Syrian, Turkish. I'm believed to be something, so they guess. Can they see the edges of Morocco in the shape of my eyes? Can they feel like I'm the product of many colonizations? How could they guess that I'm a Jewish Arab born a settler to Palestine? This man, leaning against the front door of the store I was trying to enter, was somewhat better than most. He called me a sabra, a term I never used to describe myself, yet fitting for the circumstances of my birth. Sabra, a term invented by the Zionist state to describe Jewish people born in occupied Palestine. Sabra, the Hebrew word for my favorite fruit. Sabra, a move to create a nationalist identity from scratch, a way of uniting vastly different diasporic identities into one rooted in a plant abundant in the deserts of Palestine. In English, sabra is the prickly pear, the fruit of a cactus. A marvel, really, that such sweetness can grow in the desert. Out of the thorns of one of nature's most resilient plants, oblong fruits grow in a myriad of warm colors: red, yellow, orange, pink, little color-packed miracles that defy our understanding of ecology. Each fruit covered in thorns so thin, they're almost invisible to the human eye. Calling Israeli sabra is supposed to be a clever metaphor. Jews born within the Zionist state have tough exteriors and sweet insides, just like the cactus fruit. It is a thin thread to connect a nation around, but what histories of colonialism have shown us is that it is enough to create new shared identities. Calling Israeli sabra is also another humiliation inflicted to the people indigenous to the land, who themselves have used the prickly pear as a symbol of belonging for generations before their dispossession, and who are now left to use it as a symbol of their resistance and sustained existence in the face of genocide. In Palestine, they say saber saba, the patience of the cactus, to describe the resilience of the people living on a land not always kind. The people indigenous to Palestine saw their lives reflected in the thorny fruit of the cactus. Like them, it was resilient and durous. Like them, it thrived in a somewhat harsh environment. Like them, the plant extended generosity by using its resources towards creating a sweet fruit during the hottest month of July. In Palestine, the fruit of the cactus would be eaten communally, cut in slices by the men, and shared with all. Because before there was a Zionist state, there was land farmed by families who would use the prickly pear as fences between their fields, the thorns of the cactus creating a natural barrier. Before there was a Zionist state, the Felachins grew wheat and barley and olive trees and grapes and figs. They developed farming techniques that required little to no irrigation, a necessity on a land that lacked water. Before there was a Zionist state, there was an Ottoman Empire and a British mandate. Before there was a Zionist state, some of the land belonged to absentee landlords. A lot more of it was duly owned by the families tending the land. Before there was a Zionist state, belonging to the land didn't always mean deeds and records and ownerships, but sometimes it did. In Palestine, those who understood the land, those who were of the land, were its righteous owners as a collective, a community. 418 Palestinian villages were destroyed to make way for the Zionist state. I almost typed each village name so that we could collectively remember them. I wanted to write their names, but I worried you wouldn't read them. I worried that their names alone wouldn't convey the scale of the annihilation. I worried that you would think I did it as a performance and not as a prayer for their return. 418 communities with people, houses, stores, and fields raised to make way for a new reality that wanted them erased. 418 communities raised also meaning death, expulsions, dispossession, and a life of survival in the refugee camps in Jordan, in Syria, and Lebanon. In each one of the villages, I imagine a circle and a man holding a knife and an oblong fruit, generously sharing sweetness with his neighbors. In French, we called the prickly pear figue de Barbarie, or Barbary coast fig, an old-timey term to describe the portion of the African coast between Morocco and Libya, where my ancestors thrived. That's where the French encountered the fruit for the first time in their own destructive expeditions towards land they would steal a century later. But again, the prickly pear isn't native to the Barbary coast, or the Middle East for that matter. It finds its roots in the Americas, moved around to Spain after the 15th century, before being introduced to North Africa. They say that in his genocidal travels, Columbus traveled with prickly pears, feeding his people the nopal to fend off scurvy. My people do not eat the cactus, they only savor its fruits. In Morocco, they call it India, Indian fig, and the massive quantities of prickly pears cultivated in the country are moved to French supermarkets by global supply chains, trucks crossing the country in the Gibraltar Strait, trucks moving through borders inaccessible to humans in need of safety. In early September 2021, Mahmoud al-Arda and 5 other men escaped the Zionist prison of Gilboa, where they were all sentenced to live because of their resistance to the occupation of their ancestral land. They dug a tunnel with spoons, patiently dreaming about freedom on the other side. They didn't communicate with anybody on the outside for fear of repercussions. They just dug. In an article published after the escape, Al-Arda describes the amazing taste of the cactus fruit after 22 years of incarceration. A cartoon shows him hugging the cactus tree, the symbol of his people and their history. The cartoon shows him being embraced by the cactus tree in return. When I read the news of the Gilboa escapes, I cried. It was on a day where I felt despair, and that miraculous story reminded me of the ways we find freedom, slowly, with determination. When I read about Mahmoud al-Arda, I cried again, because prison, in all its cruelty, reproduces the abomination of colonialism by taking land away, by disconnecting us from plants and ecosystems and ancestral practices. The purpose of prison is to take us so far away from land and community and relationship that we forget that we belong to each other and to the seeds, the birds, the sun, the sky. I understand the need to feel embraced by a plant to feel alive. I understand that in freedom, we remember our allegiances, our kinships. I understand what it means to reclaim yourself through your connection with the land. I wonder what Mahmoud al-Arda's memories of the prickly pear are. Does he have favorite colors of it? Did he pick them directly from the cactus? Did he wear plastic bags around his hands to avoid being pricked? Or did he remember an elder cutting the fruit for him patiently, expertly, and feeding him the gift of the desert? Did he remember that in Sabah, the prickly pear, there was community and laughter and generosity and ritual? Or did it remind him of everything that was taken away from him by the people who raised me? Thank you.
Thank you for that. It was so beautiful to hear that. And congratulations, which I meant to say right as I jumped on. Congratulations on the book. It's as you know, I believe it is stunning. And so it's really great to hear it out loud. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, if we're being honest with each other, for believing in the book. I think it wouldn't exist without you. So I
It's
appreciate it.
very, very easy to believe in. I'm glad you read that piece particularly because I wanted to ask 2 things to begin. One about care for the land broadly, but another about imagery of fruit, um, not only in your work, but through the long arc of not just Palestinian life and resistance, but I think, I was thinking about this as I read it, fruit as a marker of fruit imagery as a marker of resistance, I think, throughout many movements. I think in Black American freedom struggles, there is fruit symbolism, particularly in the American South. And there is, like fruit symbolism in apartheid South Africa. There was occasional fruit symbolism that would pop up in both songs and writings and these things. For you as a writer, do you what calls you to return to imagery of fruit, and do you see yourself as someone building upon or adding to a lineage of fruit and fruit imagery in a history of or a lineage of um, for lack of a better term, revolutionary writing, revolutionary archival of a movement or moment or place or land?
There's like the joke in diasporic writing workshops where everybody writes about the mango, right? Like the
Yep.
diaspora writer writes about the mango. And I think that we're all in on the joke. And I think that when I started thinking about this particular essay, I was thinking about like, what is my mango actually? And thinking about like how in diasporic literature, we often go back to the food, right? Because that's often the only connection that we have. But I like with the prickly pear specifically, it's the first essay that I wrote where I was like, oh, I think I understand what I'm doing craft wise, where I was like, oh, I can look at one thing that's really simple, right? So it's a fruit. And then I can start like mapping out the complexity of the prickly pear because, I don't, it's not in this part of the essay. But for example, the prickly pear is the reason why in Oaxaca, there's indigenous people were not enslaved, and uh, Oaxaca as a state in Mexico ended up still having like so much indigenous land because of the prickly pear and the expertise of indigenous people. And so I think that like when I'm thinking about fruit specifically for myself, and I think that that's why all revolutionary movements connect to plants and fruit,
Yeah.
and is because the land doesn't lie, right? The land reminds you who are the people whose it is, right? Who are the people who are tending to the land, and who are the people who understand how it works, right? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, no, go ahead. I just said yeah. I let out a happy sigh of yeah. Go ahead.
Right, because I think that like this is the question that like I think that especially in this moment, people think about a lot, like what does it mean to be indigenous? And being indigenous to a place is to have a relationship with the land. And if you don't know what you're doing, the fruit is not going to grow, right? It's going to get destroyed by parasites and insects and, mildew. So, yeah.
I want to tread carefully at this step because I want to be clear that I'm not conflating gentrification and genocide, right? However, but slash and perhaps the way that I came to understand at a very, very young age, and my parents were kind of on the front lines of even before I was born, organizing against South African apartheid. And so I understood apartheid as kind of a vague material moment in history. But I also now look back, when I look upon, say, what I know now more concretely of South African apartheid, what I know now of not only genocidal intent, but of kind of the Zionist entity slowly and sometimes not so slowly building towards this intent for and acting upon it for many, many years, right? What I think to back towards the way that land is treated, which due to my it's a very Western approach that I'm taking here due to how I grew up, where I think first of how gentrification works in the corner of America I grew up in, where there is land that people are caring for, and then it gets kind of bulldozed and made into something else that is haphazardly thrown up. And then the people who care for the land are no longer on the land, and new people arrive, and everything just starts to look the same. Like everything looks like a strip mall. Everything looks like because this is serving a people who maybe have no interest in the land. And so, what I really I mean, I love the title of your book, but I also love how the title manifests itself in so many movements. It's like looking at the title and the intentions of the title through several different mirrors. And I guess the broad question I have is how you consider there are just many ways to kill a people, and there are many ways, as we're seeing now, to erase a people. And this is maybe a question that is large and a little bleak, but if if people's land is repurposed and harmed without their consent, is there any way that their histories can survive at the end of the day, right? If the land, even if the land is destroyed, if the fields are burned and the people who once loved the fields come back to it, but the fields are no longer useful, how does the people's history survive when a land is made inhospitable and unable to be cared for by those people, if that makes sense? That was a long thing.
No, I think that like it's not one, I do conflate colonialism and gentrification. I do think
Sure,
that it's the
sure,
same sentiment for myself, at least. You don't
sure.
have to go there with me, but I do think that like there is something, especially in like under racial capitalism, about like wanting to profit from Black culture and also wanting to erase its like practical, like physical manifestation, right? It's like Blackness as an idea rather than like, land actually and culture and traditions. And I feel like I think about that all the time. Philly has been, I've lived in Philly for 10 years, and Philly is changing really rapidly. And
Yes.
And, you know, as an immigrant to the US, everything that I find to love in America, because I don't know that I can go to love, has been like built by Black Americans, right? So I do want to name that. And I think that the way I think about it, I see so many parallels. Um, it's a big question. And I will play the card of, as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, you know, I do feel like, you know, when I think about like my great grandparents in Poland, for example, I don't know where they lived because Poland, you know, exterminated all the Jews and completely leveled the land. So there's no traces of like the villages that they lived in or what it looked like. But I still believe that uh, the memory lives within our bodies, right? And then, you know, it's like part of what I was trying to explore in the book is like, I don't have access to a lot of my homelands, right? Or like the landscapes of my ancestors, but I want to believe that that memory lives within my body and that the plants and the trees and the fruits that have like moved alongside my ancestors are guides for me to find the memory, right? And so I think that even when I'm thinking about like Palestinian resistance, right, a lot of it has to do with this idea of like survival and like, you know, smuggling babies out of like Zionist prisons so that like, you know, the legacy can continue. Like really this idea of like, how can we as a people keep the memory alive, which is actually a huge Jewish belief, right? We have to keep the memory alive in order, and we have to keep the lineage alive so that like we are not erased, right? And I think that like maybe the woo-woo part of my belief system is that I think that it doesn't matter how many times people try to destroy the land will still prevail, you know? Because I really do believe that, right? That like we do not understand the natural world as humans. I don't think that our brains are quite capable of like understanding it. And I do think that like the land will prevail. Like that's a deep belief.
Yeah. I love that is an optimism I'm reaching for. I'm glad that you talked about the way that things live in your body because I don't know, one of my favorite essays in the book is the Let My Back Tell the Story of My Grief, which I think I'm like a lot of people as I age, I'm always joking about the new ailments that arrive and the new, you know, the ways that I might not wake up and feel, you know, and I don't attribute that. And I think in some ways, my joking around it, certain things at least, are a way for me to kind of circumvent attributing it to anything traumatic, right? And what I loved about this essay is that not only does it deconstruct that without humor, but it's so unflinching in its honesty. And I'm generally broadly asking, perhaps, how did you, and not only in the writing that, but in your actual living, um, how do you know or work your way around mentally the kind of impulses, these sensory impulses in your body that tell you the story of your history? How did you get to that point comfortably without maybe laughing it off or maybe attributing it to something of the ravages of time? And how do you stay attuned to that kind of intuition?
You know, that's interesting because I am a pure product of the French education system. So cynicism is a deep part of like my everyday life, you know? Um, but I also, you know, I was raised by people who all lived with disabilities that were all kind of like tied to ancestral pain, right? Like both my grandparents on my dad's side lost their legs during the Second World War, actually. And I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born. But my grandmother, you know, that was like an experience. And then my dad had some pain in his leg that was like this mysterious thing, you know, that always showed up and that I was like a big central part of his life. And so I think that like innately I always understood that like the pain was like a metaphor, you know, of something that had happened to the ancestors. But I also think that like it took me to, you know, I spent my 20s completely dissociated. So I can't tell you what my body felt like or like, you know, any of that. And I think that like the early part of my 30s probably too. And I think that yeah, after 35, I started noticing, right? Like, oh, you know, I started having injuries in my knees and I was like, oh fuck, now I'm like one of the people in the lineage who's going to complain about their legs. I don't want to be that person. Um, but then also starting to do physical therapy and like meeting with body workers who are like, oh, you have the tightest back I have ever met in my life. What is going on? Right. And like starting to interrogate that for myself. Um, yeah, I think that like it also, I don't want to pathologize it, right? Because I think that like
Mhm.
there's this thing with like trauma survivors specifically, where then we're like, well, I'm fucking cursed. My ancestors suffered and I will suffer too. But I think that actually acknowledging it for myself gave me agency and power. So I was able to like kind of, instead of feeling the curse, being like, oh, it's part of me, let me like try to control it or something, which is maybe more of my compulsion. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I also, oh, I should say, if you are attending, first, thank you for being here. If you have questions, put them in the little Q&A box, and then at around like 7:50, I think I will sort through the ones and ask them. But I always forget to remind people of that, and then they don't see them. So please be robust in your curiosity. Um, I also was interested in lineage as something I've been thinking about with my own work, particularly my last book, my relationship with my father. And as I get older, this idea or this feeling that this awareness that this older person I love will not live forever, and nor will I, and therefore there has to be some kind of joyful common ground felt, and then the grief that comes with the several abandonings of that, like me saying, oh, maybe that's not what it should be, or maybe I should not pursue that. Was it how did you navigate, be it through circumventing or confronting the hard realities of these complications of either having relationships with elders that are not as you maybe as they once were, or not as you wanted them to be, or having relationships that don't exist and therefore having to perhaps imagine the world where they walk alongside you that is not possible? Like, how did you, for me, navigating that was such a challenge. And the challenge is, it was like a moving target. The challenges shifted every time I sat to reconsider that. And so I'm wondering how you navigated that particular movement.
Yeah. My father was born 2 days before me. So I was born on Christmas Day. He was born on December 23rd. And I haven't seen my father in 12 years. We've been estranged for that long. But every year, there's that feeling like I know his birthday comes before me. And every year I think about the fact that I do not know the version of him that he is now. Right.
Hmm.
Like that's been so long that there's like, he's almost like fixed in time for me. And so is my mother, right? I don't know what they look like. I don't know what their voice sounds like at this point. But what's interesting is that, so biological family, there's not a ton of, I don't have connection with my elders, but I work with people who have been incarcerated for a long time. And so I get to work alongside people, who are coming out of prison in their 60s, 70s, and sometimes people who are like coming out in compassionate release. And so that means that I will like be in relationship with them as they transition towards death, right? Um, and I and also elderly people love me. So I have like friends, we're in their 80s and like we're drinking brandy together, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I feel like there's something a little, I feel like I'm cheating a little because I get to be in relationship with elders who I choose to be in relationship with, which I do think is like a cheating of like that question of like, how do you deal with watching somebody grow older, right? That you have known your whole life. And because I think with my history of both migration and estrangement, I don't have access to that. And yeah, it does feel like I'm cheating. So I, I have the impulse of asking you how you deal with it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I feel that. I'm smiling because similarly, I have, I was someone who was incarcerated on and off for a lot of my late teens and early 20s. And when I was 24-ish, I had like run out of chances and was going to have to do like a very long sentence. But the judge was kind of like, you can do that, or you can volunteer for a year at this, home, this elder home in the east side of Columbus where I'm from. And I took that option, obviously. And then I've just been there ever since. It was like at first a very reluctant, rageful volunteering. And I've just been there for the past, I guess now 15 years. And, so I'm in community. These are like my friends. Like you meant, these are actually my friends. I'm in real community with them. And that does feel like cheating the realities of this kind of world we're in. Yeah, the thing you mentioned about not knowing the version of your father, I mean, that's really, it haunts me in a way, you know? Um, or knowing a version that is like knowing like a flimsy version. I find myself like reaching for the imagination of what this version could be and how they could live alongside me. Um, and that is not numbed, but that is lessened a bit by saying, I am walking alongside elders who have lived a long time. You know, like I love people as friends who have lived a long time, and I learned from them. I learned alongside them. And um, yeah, no, I appreciated that. And like, um, I also loved Asher because of how it's opening. I'm not going to read your own work at you, but I love the my grandfather and I are connected by our names in a sliver of my heart. Um, and that really felt tender to me, because, and maybe you don't feel this way, or I'd love to hear it, but I feel like even when we don't have that physical connection, earthly or otherwise, with our elders, we carry some things that they have imparted, you know, put upon us, be it names or personality traits, physical appearance, like whether we want to or not. Yeah, does that also feel like cheating, where it's like I don't have to have a relationship or an earthly relationship, but I have a small part of me that I love that belongs to someone who I cannot touch.
Yeah. I think a lot about, when I write about my grandfather, I think that there's this question around masculinity, right? And what does it mean to love like really flawed men, which you wrote about quite a bit recently. Uh, but it was this thing where like growing up, there was like this looming presence, right? There was like this mythical man that we had to like revere. And I didn't know, my grandfather died 5 years before I was born. Um, and I could not find kindness towards him, right? Or love, because I'd always understood him as like somebody I should fear. And ironically, I'm basically dedicating my career to supporting men into shifting patterns of masculinity, right? How do you like soften? How do you move from like having like harm to like softness and vulnerability, right? How do you do this really difficult work of like, unraveling American masculinity specifically? And so there was this moment where I was like, shit, like I keep talking to all those dudes about how there's a version of themselves that's blooming. And then there's this man that I've never met that I could not find love and kindness for. How do I get towards that? Right. Every time I thought about him, I felt like a deep hardness. And like for people in the audience, my middle name is my grandfather's name, which is, my parents just set me up really early on for some gender trouble, for sure. Um, and so, there was this thing where I was like, I am connected to this person. I do not feel kinship for him, but I kind of want to. And I realized that I was just scared that he would be rejecting me, right? And so that's when I went to see an ancestral healer, which is another part two of my woohoo tendencies. That's when we talked about it. And that's when she was like, yeah, your grandfather lives in your heart. And she was telling me all those stories about his childhood and who he was, and suddenly he was a human again, right? And in the process of like him being in my body, but b him like me starting to see the picture of him before he became the mythical creature, I was able to like see him as a human. And then obviously when you see people as humans with flaws but also beauty, then love him. And that was like such a healing moment for me. I still don't know that I love that I have his name, but I think that now we have a relationship.
Yeah. Um, this book, why I was so drawn to it, which to be clear, I think people should also understand that I first encountered this book. I'm like trying to read to look if there's a date on it, but I think I first encountered this book in like 2022. Um, it was floored by it in 2022. And um, even then, like it is obviously arriving to the world now, where people can perhaps project what they are experiencing the world onto the political, I don't like the word political project, for lack of a better one, political project of this book. but there is something, one, that I enjoy about the book, and that it is speaking towards a history that for those people who had even read about or organized around or fought around Palestinian liberation before last fall. And of course, I'm not shaming anyone for arriving when they've arrived. Though, though perhaps now in June of 2024, that arrival is if folks aren't there, perhaps now is it's now or never, perhaps, for you. But I was interested in what it might feel like. And of course, this happens with people at many margins all the time. Black American writers, it happens with queer writers, where you've written into a political idea that you have lived your entire life. And sometimes the work is released into a world that is either newly awakened to or recontextualizing the nuanced politics of your actual material existence that you have been not only living but writing about for as long as you have. And so this is maybe a silly broad question, not silly, but no, maybe broad. But what has that been like? I mean, I'm like I remember when A Little Devil in America came out, which was a book I wrote about Black performance, which it came out in early 2021, which was of course right after summer 2020. And reading some of the responses to it, even through gratitude, I was like, I feel like I'm losing my mind a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, one, this is not the first book about Black performance, and two, this is like my full life's, So I'm curious how you're measuring that, or what you're feeling, and if there's been pleasure or anxiety or rage or yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because some of the stuff that I wrote in this book, I feel like sentences like from the river to the sea. I think that that was like language that was like very common in like organizing spaces and like in people, with people who were familiar or connected to Palestine. And then, October 7th happened, and then suddenly it was everywhere. And I was like, oh wow, that's like there's been such a drastic shift in the discourse, which with American politics, no offense, American people, but often the discourse changes, but the realities don't, right? Um, and so that was interesting. But what's funny is that like my friend who's a Lebanese herbalist, Leila Ferrali, she just released a book about plants of the Swana region that came out in February. And we've been like, in this like chats, WhatsApp thread for 2 years about our books, and both of us being like, this is like the most bizarre experience, right? Because we've been like, she's been doing this for decades. I've been thinking about that for a long time. And like having like, there's the grief of the genocide happening right now, the unraveling of like, there's like so many veils that are being lifted. And then we have both to like be excited about a book, right? There's the joy of like this thing is coming out, but also the really bizarre thing of like the that I am, yes, like suddenly like I like both of us are asked to talk about, you know, October 7th and Hamas, and and there's all those like interesting moments. I do think that like there is joy for me in two things. One, seeing the way people are reacting to the book after the readings and telling me that like, oh, you're expressing something that I didn't have the language for and that I've been like trying to find. Like, it makes me feel like I'm doing something, right? That there is like that I'm opening for some people where maybe like it's not that they're on the fence, but they feel like, the American thing of like, I don't know enough to act. I need more, right? Like those questions. I feel like I'm like offering a little bit to that, which feels like, I'm like, okay, maybe my existence on this plane is now wasted, Um, and also I think that like one of the real moments of joy for me releasing this book is that I was in Morocco for 2 months. And I told you this, I did my first book talk of the book in Morocco to people who had not read the book. And I read one of the essays that's called The Oudads. And I had a lot of like everybody at the residency I was at was like nervous about my safety and Zionism and blah, blah, blah. And I was in a room of people who were just like, thank you. You know, like we understand what you're saying. And I think that it helped me decenter the American gaze, which is so liberating, right? When you manage to like get out of like the empire for a second and you're like, oh, there's another way of thinking about this. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing I want to say just as another shout of praise is that the way this book talks about land excites me in part because I came to reading the book maybe a year after there's a film by Palestinian filmmaker Jumana Mana called Foragers. I don't know if you've seen it or folks, but like I saw that in maybe like 2021. And even with what I are, the thing about it is you are, and why I think I have grace for people's arrivals when they arrive, because you're like always arriving, right? You're always stacking things and like building things alongside what you always already know. And I felt like in some ways that film was really formative for me in the way I started thinking about land in a global sense. And I feel like your book it was like there was it was like the puzzle was finished except for one other piece. And it felt like your book like slotted perfectly into unlocking another level of considering both land and body in the way that film does. So thank you for that. And also, you know, I mean, I'm also someone who works with incarcerated folks and corresponds with incarcerated folks. And it, I feel like in those spaces, one of the um, a writer I love deeply who's incarcerated and writes for a zine called In the Belly is his name is Yair Carter, and we had a talk recently, and he was like, "Listen, man, like a good way to decentralize myself from thinking about this everything resistance through a Western lens is that like I am in an old prison that was built years ago, and the conditions inside here are as brutal as you can imagine, and also if I am thinking about people in the Congo or Sudan or like people who are actually waking up and figuring out how to survive, that is a different kind of, talk about like open air prison and the realities of what that looks like. It's a different kind of thing. And so I am wondering how you can not only get to that place in your work, but in your actual work on the page, but how you get to that consistent decentering in your actual living practice, because I am deeply aware that it is something that has to happen multiple times, you know what I mean? And also the decentering of the Western idea, the Western politic, and also um, you have to live it in order to write it. So I'm wondering how you get to that place and stay in that place with any consistency.
Yeah. It's a good question. I do think that like, I've lived in the US full time for like 11 years now. But growing up, I was like the kid, like in the like, I don't know that you have that in the US. Every time I talk about it to people, they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? The people selling posters that are just like black and white pictures on the sidewalk, like that's a very common thing in France. And often is just like blown up pictures of like political heroes. So you will have Che Guevara and like Gandhi and like Malcolm X and like MLK. And for me as a kid, in my bedroom as a 10-year-old, I literally had Malcolm X and Gandhi in my bedroom. And I don't know why, right? But like I read Malcolm X's autobiography when I was like 10 or 11, right? And it just like, I think that like from a very young age, I had like this like weird like third worldist like understanding of the world. And I will like probably like attribute that to my father. Um, but because of that, like, and then I did my all my education in France. And then when I got to the US, I think that there was this moment where I got a little lost because I think that the American empire just swallows you. And it's like this really like, it's like really insidious in this way where it actually reminds me of PTSD, where it's like you're in an episode without realizing that you're in an episode actually. And that's the feeling of America in my body. But because like, I've lived in like Nepal, which is like one of the few countries in the world that has never been colonized. Shout out to Nepal and the mountains. And I've like traveled a lot. I think that every time I travel and I leave the US, I can feel my body just like, I was just explaining it to people the other day. It's like, it's really bizarre. I can feel my body softening. and like kind of like the ability to just like open to vulnerability that comes from not surviving the American empire in that way that we have to in American cities. And, you know, after spending 2 months in Morocco, where I was really feeling that softness, and I was like, whoa, I'm a different person. A week into Philadelphia, it was back, right? Like I could feel the hardening of my body, like immediately. Like, you know, it's like the tensing up of the shoulders. It's like even like the inability sometimes to imagine myself outside of the borders of America, right? Like when you live in the US, sometimes it's so difficult to imagine yourself living a different reality. And, you know, I have not, like most of my life, I've lived outside of the US and still I feel that stuckness, right? Um, but also I will say that like, as somebody who has spent a lot of time with a lot of revolutionary people in prison like you, I do want to say that like there is this very specific flavor of revolution that comes out of like incarcerated people that are still holding down some of the things that I think that like we're forgetting about sometimes, right? Because they're still reading the text, they're still like studying, they're still like, you know, debating. Let me ask you a question, right? And suddenly you're talking about George Jackson again, and you know, arguing about was he a sexist or not. My opinion is that he was, but whatever.
Of course.
Uh,
Yes, yes.
you know, but that's part of the debate. But you know, like people thinking about all those different rebellions and uprisings and movements, right? They have that like actual map in their head that I think a lot of us are losing out here. And so I think I've learned so much from incarcerated people too, you know. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking about a lot of them, like, you know, when I wrote the book, I was thinking about that. Like, I want, you know, well, I don't know that they will let my book inside prisons, but if they do, this is really like this is some of the stuff that I do want to say to some of the people who have like raised me, right? War in the
Yes,
dungeon.
for sure. I know we're running up against time. I have to go to audiences. So I wanted to ask about pleasure, about how you you know, like I had never even considered this. I try to ask other writers this, particularly when books are weighty or navigate, because I never consider it. And then, you know, one time on my book tour, a person was like, what did you do when you turned away from the work? What did you do to kind of refill yourself? Um, you know, in between the work and the world itself, right? Where for me, there has to be some kind, even if it's like a small sliver, because the rage I feel at the world is untenable. And the way that that funnels, the way that like both the rage and heart, I think, and all of the parts of me that turn towards the world can funnel back into the work. That is also, that all of the time is untenable. And so for me, there's like a little, I think about it like a little footbridge, like a little tiny bridge of a place where I can be at like playoff basketball for one night or whatever. Yeah. And so I'm curious how what bridge you're building to kind of meander between the world and the work that refills you.
Well, meandering is one of them for sure. I think that like I still like feel so much pleasure. Like I think that like, you know, headphones on, walking
Yeah.
down the city with you know, depending on the mood, it's always really loud and just like trying to find beauty. I'm really on this kick of like my best friend always makes fun of me. Well, I don't know if she's making fun of me, but like I take pictures of things that I find beautiful and it really helps me. Like, you know, there's like a neuroscience thing about rewiring your brain towards beauty and pleasure. And so I'm like trying to do that. Like I walk down the street and I'm like, ooh, beautiful. Let me take a picture. And like so that I can kind of like feel that feeling whenever I'm feeling the rage again, you know? Like I can go back to the picture and feel that. Um, but I think that like, you know, I'm just like, it's so hard to find joy in this moment, right? Or like to find that bridge, right? Or like to find the ways to nourish ourselves. Um, I do this exercise with people when, especially when they're in acute crisis, which is to ask them 3 things that they're grateful for and 3 things that they're excited about every day. So I will do that with somebody coming out of incarceration. Every day we'll be on the phone and I will be like, tell me 3 things you're grateful for. And sometimes the thing that we're grateful for, and I'll do it too. Like it's not just I'm asking, we're doing
Right.
it. And sometimes like the answer is like, I'm breathing, you know, I'm not dead yet. Um, But I think that like in this moment, and I feel like you taught me that with your writing too, like finding those pockets of joy, right? And like being able to hold them for what they are in that moment and remembering, you know what I'm saying? It's like there's like
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
like there's the grief, there's this ocean of grief and rage, and then like holding on to those like really small moments, and they do add up, right? uh they add up to enough. I don't know yet, but trying,
I love that. Thank you for that. All right, I'm going to ask the questions that the audience asked, and folks can add more as they arrive. Diaspora as it relates to animals, because you have that one essay in the book that I actually had a question about that was essentially just this. Or there's multiple, because there's essay about storks. There's
Mhm.
out yeah. Can you talk about diaspora as it relates to animals?
I think that like, so for context, this essay about the Audads is about this really interesting, like, so it's the Barbary sheep, which is an animal that's endemic to Morocco, that somehow was moved to the US, first in zoos and then in Texas, because and now there's like hunts of those Barbary sheeps, right? It's like people pay to go to a ranch and like just shoot the Barbary sheep because they proliferated in Texas like so much that they're invasive, whereas in Morocco they're actually dying and like they're becoming like extinct. And I kept thinking about this idea. It's like really thinking about this notion of like diaspora and complicating it a little, because I think that sometimes I get frustrated, especially with Jewish diaspora, we'll just name it, where we're staying in the memory, right? But we're staying in a very specific slice of the memory and not going into the complication of it. And so that essay was like trying to deal with that. The storks, and I think that like it's like for years I talk shit about poets for years and years and years and years. I was always like, poets are losers. I don't understand why they have so many feelings. And then I was in a writing workshop and somebody was like, what are you talking about? You're doing poetry, right? And the reason why I'm saying this is because I think that in the metaphor of the animals, I'm able to, find the language that I don't quite have yet, right? If I can look at the Aoudad and like really examine the Aoudad for a really long time, I think that it helps me make sense of my own experience as somebody who's like family was both forced to move and also with settling land that is not theirs, right? And it's a really like, I don't want to just like think about myself as like I could just choose the identity that's easy, right? But I think it's really important for me to like complicate that question for myself. And so the animals help me do that. And the storks, when I was in Morocco, I saw storks every single fucking day.
No
And
way.
yeah, every day I would walk past the old Jewish quarter and there was storks every single day until the last day when I went to the train station and there was no stork, but I saw storks every single day. So they feel like, like a family of sorts for sure.
Yeah. Um, Second question from Greg. I wonder if there's flora and fauna that you have connected with since these essays, and how have you connected with it?
Ooh, people who know me in real life know that I'm a little I will hug a tree. I spend a lot of time hugging trees. Um, I think that like I have I think that I've also complicated my relationship to the plants in the book, which I think is maybe more interesting to me, going even deeper in those relationships, right? Like when I'm thinking about the prickly pear, for example, spending a bunch of time in Mexico and understanding the ramifications of that, or even the lindens that I talk about, which are, Philly is full of lindens, spending more and more years, right? Because the book was written in 2022, right? And wrote it like that year. And so it's been 2 years of me spending more time with all of those plants. And my organizing philosophy is to go small but deep, right? And I think that the more like rooted I can be in my relationship to flora and fauna feels exciting to me.
And the last one for now, I think someone is searching for the Q&A box, so there might be another one pops up. What books do you hope will neighbor yours on a reader's bookshelf? Like, who are the, I guess I'll expand on this in my own way too. Like, what lineage do you feel like this book fits into, or what lineage would you be overjoyed for it to fit into?
Um, you know, there's many people that I'm thinking about. And I'm like thinking about my editor's bookshelf behind me where there's like Edward Said's Orientalism on there, next to like Rajiv Mohabir's Anti-Man, and there's like Franny Choi's book. There's like all those people I think who are thinking about those questions of the end of the world, the catastrophes, and how do we survive. It is trite to say that I would want to be in conversation with yours, but I think that that's pretty obvious to people who are listening to us. I also think that I hope that the book can be in conversation with text that's maybe less literary and that is more like directly revolutionary, right? Because I think that that is like an aspiration of mine. Um, so, as a big fan of Bobby Seale's Seize the Time, like that is like, a book that I would love for people to read as they're reading my book too, right? Like if people could like wanna like go deeper in like the Black Panther Party and Huey P. Newton, I feel like I would be very happy.
Well, okay. Can I ask one final thing, I guess, of my own? But formally, in terms of the mode of storytelling that you operate in with these kind of movements that are really that feel large and sweeping, but are so tender and so granular. Like I think um, even in that Storks piece, there's just a lot of tender drilling down of a thing. I mean, is there a lineage, Ross Gay would call it like a lineage of looking, of noticing, like people who are maybe not writers, but maybe are, who have cultivated the way that you are able to look tenderly and for a very long time at a scene, an idea, an image. Because I think you do that so well in this book. And so I'm interested in what lineage you feel a part of then. And it truly doesn't have to just be writers, but anyone that who's fortified or enriched your kind of lineage of close looking.
You know, uh, I think a lot about music in this moment and the music that I was listening to while I was writing this book, which was Dev Hynes' discography and Jasmine Sullivan, who I think that like does that actually really well, like the vignettes. Mount Erie was a big inspiration, and I think that like yeah, I would recommend that people listen to like the really like sad Mount Erie, like my wife just died Mount Erie, like a crow looked at me. I think that like this is a great companion to the book, actually. Yeah.
I love that. I would, yeah, I veered away from asking you a bunch of music questions, but I wanted to ask a few. So that was satisfying. That was very satisfying. Well, thank you so much for talking with me a bit. This was great. And I feel like it goes without saying, perhaps what I would love to say again, how much I love this book and how much it kind of um it really was like the puzzle piece that came together in not just one setting, but multiple settings for the way I've long been thinking about land, like what indigenous land is or means. And it did connect a lot of those dots that have been haunting me about the gentrification of like my childhood neighborhood that shows up, and that obsession that constantly shows up in my work. It really fulfilled. Um, it answered some real questions for me there as well, and I feel like it put it in even richer global perspective. And so I'm so thankful for you and your work, and I'm glad we got to do this.
Thank you so much, honey. What a pleasure to talk with you.